Anche, papastim si kasun. So yesterday we went out and we went to the swamp and we went to go pick wascatamo. And what we did this morning is I took the wascatamo and I washed it in the sink with clean water just to get all the mud and all of the kind of muskeg washed out of it, and to wash away any bugs or any dirt on there. But with the one we picked, we noticed that there's a little spot here that's kind of starting to go slimy and starting to rot a little. So before we start preparing this, we're going to cut that piece out of there because it'll start to spread to the rest of it. So we want to make sure we stop that spread. So we're just going to cut that piece out and just try and save as much as we can, because this stuff is really hard to pick. So you want to use as much of the wascatamo as you can, especially for all the hard work that goes into collecting it. You'll see I've cut all of that rotted part off. There's not really much of that I can use. Now what I'll do is I'll just go return that back to the land when I'm done. So when we were picking the wascatamo, I talked a little bit about the uses, but before we do that, we see here on the end of it where it had broken off before and it sort of healed itself. We're going to just cut that off too, because that's going to be useful to us. But I talked a little bit about the uses, and before we start preparing it for drying it, we'll talk a little bit about other uses for it, because with wascatamo, because it has anti-inflammatory ability, antibiotic ability, it'll help to deal with, say, inflamed muscles or inflamed joints or stuff like arthritis or sciatica on the back. And the reason I mention that is the only use I know for it in its raw form, how it was used, is people would, if they had a bad back, like arthritis in the back or sciatica, or those backbone problems, not so much the muscular problems, but problems with the bone, they would use the wascatamo raw. And what they would do is they take a piece of it and they would split it down the middle while it's raw like this and still full of all the water and everything. And they would split it down the middle like this, and they would use it just like this raw, and they would put it on wherever the back muscles, backbones are hurting and back problems are, or there's arthritis in the back, and they would lay that on there, and they would be told to sleep with that overnight, just like this, laying on the part of them that's hurting, and it would hopefully pull out that inflammation or that the pain in the backbones. So that's the only use I know for it in its raw form. Otherwise, the other uses, we need to dry it. So with this one, how we would dry it is we usually just cut it into sort of like little slices, and then we let those slices dry. And with the wascatamo right now, it's super spongy. It feels just like a sponge, just like a kind of a hard sponge. So once all the water dries out of there, it shrinks to maybe 1/10 the size. So meaning it's going to go from this size to maybe just a bit thicker than my thumb. So it's going to really shrink down in size as all of that water comes out, because it is loaded with water right now. So we want to get that dried out, because if we try and keep it like this, then it's just going to turn into this stuff and just eventually just turn slimy and spoil. and there's not going to be any use to it. So with a lot of our roots, we dry them so that it still holds the medicinal value. It holds the medicine in there and gets rid of all the water, and it keeps it from spoiling. So we want to make sure that we get it nice and dry. So usually with the whole pieces like this, that's what we do, is we just cut it into slices. Just because it's going to be easier to use later, once it's in slices like this, we can break off the pieces that we need to make our medicines. Now, I've known of some people who say that if somebody's got a really bad infection, they would try and use this as well while it's wet like this and in these slices. And I've heard stories of where it even really bad infections, like even almost gangrene. So where a part of the body is kind of spoiled or rotting from an infection, they would put that right on that infected part or that inflamed part, and because it's got that antibiotic property as well as that anti-inflammatory properties, it would suck all of that infection out of there, and it would suck it into the wascatamo and get rid of that, like, really bad infections. Otherwise, once it's dry, it'll do the same thing. Once we take this and we dry it, and it's just a little puck of wascatamo, we would crush that and grind it up into almost a powder, and we'd use it in the same way. If there's a bad infection or bad sores, we would put that powder, usually with something like a little bit of bear grease or something. And again, that antibiotic and that anti-inflammatory would get rid of an infection really quickly. So again, we want to cut it into these slices. And once we've got it in the slices, just to make it way easier to dry, what we're going to do is just take I've got some sinew here in a fairly big needle, and I'm going to just take a piece of my sinew, put it through my needle, and now I'm just going to start sewing through these pieces, and it really doesn't matter where, because it's going to shrink around the string anyway. So I'm going to just tie a knot on one side so I don't accidentally pull it all the way through. And I'm just going to thread through each of the slices. So we dry something like rat root in a similar way, because we don't want the pieces touching, or they're going to keep that water in them longer and might end up spoiling. Because once you do cut them, you want to make sure that they're going to just dry right out as quickly as possible. Because the longer it takes to dry, then you're going to risk having them spoil. So I'm almost finished with this one. So there, once we've got them all on the rope, we're just going to spread them out so they're not touching each other. just enough space. We'll start from the back, just so they're not going to touch. And you probably want to separate them too once you hang them, because when you hang it up to dry, of course some of them are going to move, so before you leave it to dry, and when you tie your rope, they'll be hanging like this, but like I said, you don't want any of them touching, so they'll dry much quicker, and you keep them separated from each other on that long string. And probably better to separate them at least like 2 fingers length away from each other, just to make sure that they dry quicker. So that is how we would dry our Huascatamo for storage and use for later, for whenever we need that medicine. So later on, after it's all dried out, it'll actually look, this is some that's already been dried out. So this was probably a fairly big one as well, but it went from this size to that size once it got all dried out. So you'll see once all that water's out, it goes to this size. And this will be easy to store now. It'll last for a really long time. And some of them you'll see they're a little bigger pieces, but those were because they were sliced thicker. But you could see how it looks when it's dry. So what we do is we take this now and just powder it, or grind it up, or make it into a powder for use in medicines. I'll talk about outside the body use, but I'll never talk about how to use it inside the body, because that needs to be done by a knowledge holder, elder who really knows what they're doing. Because a lot of these plants, although they're medicines, they can be just like any other medicine. If you don't use them properly, they could be dangerous, cause harm, get you sick, or even worse. So we want to be very careful with anything we're taking by the mouth. So like I said, I'll never talk about that stuff. That needs to be done by an elder and a knowledge keeper who knows their medicines with any teas or anything we're making. So that is how we prepare our Huascatamo for storage. So we'll take this, hang it, and it's probably going to take at least a good week to completely dry and get like this. So I'll hang it somewhere not in the dark, or somewhere where it's going to get some sunlight, or really dry at least, and it's going to dry up nicely for storage. And then later we just store it in a bin, or store it in a paper bag or something, but just anything that's going to keep moisture away from it. Because if it does get moisture, it's not going to turn back into this. It'll just turn into mush, and then it'll turn more into this nasty stuff. So that is how we prepare Huascatamo. Uksamaga.